It's good to have all of you back this morning. It's good to be here. We look forward to a really good program after last night when we had Lloyd Allen and Karen Smith. Our two speakers this morning are Dr. Raymond Bailey and Dr. Bill Leonard. Dr. Bailey was a longtime professor here at Southern Seminary, and before I go through a little bit of that, it does show the influence of Glenn Hinson, and just if you get into studying like Hinson does, you're going to do Thomas Merton. And we saw Thomas Merton last night with Lloyd Allen, and we see Thomas Merton again today with Raymond Bailey. Dr. Bailey is a graduate of Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Texas Tech, still in the Final Eight, Dr. Bailey. That's not bad. I don't know if you should bet on them, but anyway. MDiv and PhD here in Louisville at Southern. I did some post-doctoral work other places. He has, I remember a little book he wrote in the same series that Dr. Hinson wrote on, early church book. It was actually the book where Dr. Hinson wrote on the foreshortening of prophetic abilities of Jesus, and it was one of the first times he got called a heretic. I don't know if he remembers that. That was a very influential book on my life, however. But after that, Dr. Bailey really did begin to focus on Merton and has a book entitled Thomas Merton on Mysticism. In addition to being a scholar on Merton and other issues of church history, he has become known as just a great pastor, a superb preacher. He was at Lyndon Baptist Church here. And from 1995 to 2010, which is kind of where I reconnected and to see him again, he was at 7th and James Baptist Church. It's literally right across the street from the building in which I work. All of you, I'm sure, know his spouse, Pat, as well. She was here. As well. They were here 16 years on the faculty. She was in social work. She also retired as director of the Center for Crime Victims and Children in Waco. They now live here in Kentucky, but the one thing they have continued to do, which is the right thing to do, is that they are super fans of the Baylor Lady Bears basketball team. We play today against South Carolina, which means some of us will have our phones on during the afternoon lectures. I know you will. I'm going to finish. I'm going to ask him to come up and do his lecture on the pilgrimage of Merton. I like to preach. I've actually preached a lot during my day. I've done interim pastorates and bivocational things and down the way. But when I took preaching at Southern Seminary, I had preached one time in my life before I took preaching with Dr. Raymond Bailey. And so having only preached one time and had a preaching assignment, weakly and wobbly went over to the library and found a book of preaching outlines, which was mistake number one. Number two, the book of outlines had alliteration, and that was mistake number two. So I preached a sermon, and at the end of it, Dr. Bailey had students. I hope you do not remember this story. He had students, and he let the students talk back to you. What did you like, didn't like about the sermon? And I don't remember the console, but he looked at me and said, "Oh, I love that alliteration. It'll help me remember that sermon the rest of the day." Dr. Bailey immediately stood up and said, "I hate alliteration." And I want you to know, in all of the church history lectures that I have done in my life since that day, I only have one that alliterates. It's on Irenaeus, and I got that from Lloyd Allen. Dr. Bailey, come, let us hear from you.
Let me begin with a word of appreciation to Bill Johnson, to this committee, for putting this together and for continuing this tradition. I wish every church had something like this. It's so important. I remember that Quaker theologian who was very popular, wrote a book on the church, and he said every church ought to be a seminary because every church ought to train people to go out and do the work of the ministry. And that's been an important notion to me and a part of this church. And I want to thank this church, which has meant so much to me during my life. It is not a mega church. One of the interesting things is, what do you say is a great church? What's a great church? And Southern Baptists have been confused on that for a long time. But this is not a mega church, but it's a faithful church. And that's what we all strive to be. And I'm so grateful for those of you who carry on the work of the Lord here in this place so faithfully. And then just a little quick prolegomena of what I'm going to say. Primarily, I just wanted to use that word and let Bill Leonard know I knew one big word. I had never heard of Thomas Merton until I came under the influence of Glenn Hinson. And really, Pat and I, in those days, I was teaching at Bellarmine while going to seminary, and we lived right across the street from St. Agnes Roman Catholic Church, a Passionist church here in town. And you will recall that Thomas Merton and Karl Barth died on the same day. And St. Agnes Church had a joint mass in honor of these two people. And I thought, who in the world deserves to share a mass with the most prolific, not necessarily the most profound, we'll disagree on that one way or the other, but the most prolific theologian of the 20th century. And that kind of prompted me to go further with Glenn and let him lead me on. One other story about Glenn and our relationship so much, there were in those days several professors who invited me to study with them for my PhD. And I considered several of them, and the day came when I had to make the decision. And I went home and I told Pat that I had made no decision. She said, "What did you choose?" And I said, "I chose church history." And she said, "If we have to stay here 2 more years, couldn't you have chosen something interesting?" Well, actually, I have always had eclectic curiosity, and nothing was able to include so much as church history does. And when church history, if people understand, history is not a matter of memorizing dates and places and names. I know some people who can give you the name and the reign of every pope of the Catholic Church in the whole history, but they don't know anything about history. They don't understand historiography. They don't understand why we write. They don't understand how the heartbeat of the church and church history is captured. And Glenn Hinson taught me that. Indeed, when I conclude this paper, some of you will recognize, at least in my opinion, that Thomas Merton never did have a fulfillment of his ideas. He, of course, died prematurely, untimely death. But I have felt that Glenn Hinson is the incarnation of the spirit of Thomas Merton and the teachings of Thomas Merton. If you really want to understand what I'm going to try to struggle with today, to say something about Merton's contribution to our thought and development, you can see it lived out in this man's life. And I'm grateful. He is a man who knows who he is, accepts me for who I am, and we love one another because of it. And so I'm grateful for the influence he's had on my life. I've had some great teachers, but no one influenced me more than Glenn Hinson has. Let me talk a little bit about Merton. I'm going to try to read this paper, and it's probably going to be too long. When I started out, I told Pat I'll never be able to fill an hour. I don't know where in the world I'm going to get this stuff, and I ended up with too much material, and so that's where we kind of struggle along. First of all, I think we have to ascertain, and I don't know, how many of you know anything about mysticism or much about mysticism, but I want to just touch and say, and by the way, My recommendation would be, if you want to learn something about mysticism, there's no better place to start than with the lady that was presented to us last night and her marvelous book on mysticism. I think that's Evelyn Underhill is just the very foundation and was very helpful to me when I began my studies. And you have to recognize that Merton is a part of a long tradition. And this is something I didn't know and understand when I came to Southern Seminary. A long tradition that runs through all churches, all groups of religion, this mystical tradition. There is the rational, there is the dogmatic, and then there is the experiential and the mystical that runs through. In the Catholic Church, you can see it in Aquinas and Francis. And in other churches, you'll find. I did not know, and I was tempted to do my paper on this subject, how many Baptist mystics that we have that we've never identified in that way. But he belongs to that great tradition. In that tradition, it has been usually to think of 4 stages of development when one wants to ascend the mystical ladder somewhat. First of all, there is that burning desire, that desire to know, experience God better, to come closer to God, and one has that longing. And then there is what we call the period of purgation, where we have to get out the old to let the new in. It's kind of like you may have heard the story of the young man who came to the wise teacher, the greatest of teachers in his tradition, and told him, I want to learn everything there is to know, and I want you to teach me. And the young man was invited in, and the elder ordered tea, and the tea came, and they began to pour the tea, and the tea ran over the cup and soon ran over the saucer, and the young man said, stop, the cup is too full. He said, as you are too full of yourself, and there's no room for anything else. And that's often our problem with God, that the notion is you need that period of purgation, that period of cleansing and emptiness to make a place in your life for God. And certainly the frenetic way we live today, that would be true. Then there is a period where one has a discovery and arrives at a place of knowing, it's a place of experiencing. Then very often there is the dark night of the soul, that you go from there. And I'm not sure, by the way, that Merton ever got out of the dark night of the soul. Merton describes these stages in this way. A certain distance or detachment from the ordinary and secular concerns of worldly life, a monastic attitude, whether partial or total, temporary or permanent. Secondly, a preoccupation with a radical inner depth of one's religious and philosophical beliefs, the inner and experimental ground of those beliefs, and their outstanding spiritual implications. And thirdly, a special concern with inner transformation, a deepening consciousness toward an eventual breakthrough and discovery of a transcendent dimension of life beyond that of the ordinary empirical self and of ethical and pious observance. So I think that one can see these, whether one takes the traditional views or Merton's ideas, and in several of these books he does this in a different way. But you can identify in Merton's biography those various steps. These may be expressed or understood as a sense of calling and a period of emptying, followed by a sense of peaceful rest, and then the dark night of the soul. And Merton sees union with all people seeking God. He finally came to the conclusion that with all people seeking God, regardless of their religious background. We'll talk more about that later in the paper. It's very interesting to those of you, if you're beginners with Merton. Seven Story Mountain, of course, is his most famous book, most popular book. And the book which defined him, unfortunately, he hated it. He talks about it time and again, how he was haunted by the monster he had created in Seven Story Mountain. It's a very parochial book, a very great book of joy at his recent conversion. But in many ways, it is too parochial and too shallow. If you want to really start with Merton, I could recommend several, but my favorite is Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. Thomas Merton was a seeker, always in process. Most people who've read his works would agree with this. In fact, when I was writing my dissertation and working on Merton, I talked to Brother Pat Hart, which was his last secretary before his death, and I said, you know, I struggle with him because he seems to change so much. He keeps denying, or what he said last time is different now. And he, with a twinkle in his eye, said, well, Raymond, the truth of the matter is that if he had lived long enough, he would have rebutted everything he ever wrote. And I think that's true. And I think he also had the amazing gift of reading people. If I had done some of the things Merton did, I would have been fired for plagiarism, because Merton had the incredible ability of taking the ideas and thoughts of others and making them a part of himself, very much a part of himself, so that they were his, and so they keep popping out in various ways to go. I'm going to talk about his biography, frankly, because I don't think that you can deal with any mystical personage, study anyone of this sort, without understanding something about their life. When you say it is experiential in nature, that mysticism is experiential in nature, then you have to look at the total experiences of life. So it'll be a review for some of you. Others of you, it may be a new introduction. Who or what was Merton seeking? If we say he was in process and he was seeking something, what was it? Was it a home, a place where he could feel he belonged? A case could be made, certainly, for a search for home. From birth, Merton was something of a nomad. He came into this world in France. His father was from New Zealand, his mother from the United States. Tom, as an infant, was baptized into the Church of England, but no church bonds were formed with that church by his father, whose church it was in his background, or his mother. They really had no church life or church experience beyond that. To escape the threat of World War I, Owen Merton, his artist father, moved his family to America. For a time, they lived with Ruth's family, an environment which he would return to many times in those early years, and one which, like his other stops on the journey, would leave its mark on him. His grandmother, particularly, was remembered with fondness. He said, "My grandmother, Gertrude Grierson, was the best of the lot. She died at 102. She is one of the people of whom I retained the strongest impression in my childhood. She taught me the Lord's Prayer. She was born in Wales of a Scotch father, but the best that is in us seems to come from her Welsh mother. It is the Welsh in me that counts. That is what does the strange things and writes books and drives me into the woods." This is the only one in his family of whom he speaks warmly, where one has a kind of a true sense of warmth in her. Owen, as soon as he could, moved the family to a place of their own in Flushing, New York. After Tom's mother's death, he moved with his father to Bermuda for a short time, then back to his grandparents, later to England with his father. In 1926, his father took up residence in France, and Tom was called back for a period. The father was an absentee father, even while Ruth was alive. And then he was so struck with guilt when Ruth died that he, in order to deal with his grief, left the boys and went other places. And so the boys had to deal with it on their own. But there in the countryside, and a lot of his books reflect on this period, he wandering the countryside of France, admiring churches and monasteries for their beauty. But from there, Tom went to live with Owen's aunt in West London, where he could attend a preparatory school. And following his father's death, he toured Italy before settling in at Clare College at Cambridge, England. Eventually, he ended up back in the United States to attend Columbia University. At Columbia, he encountered those who would lead him back to the Knob Hills of Kentucky, or to the Knob Hills of Kentucky. And this is the place where he expresses the joy of Seven-Story Mountain when he thinks he has arrived at his place. This would be the center of his life for his remaining years, but it did not bring him peace. His experience with different lands and cultures and people helped him undoubtedly with a worldview that few people have an opportunity to develop. Certainly few experience so much diversity so young. He certainly inherited the eye of an artist from his father and was later able to describe nature and architecture with great precision and feeling. His writings revealed that his sense of being settled didn't last long. Restlessness and the sense he was not yet home soon returned. He wrote the foolishness of monks moving from order to order, monastery to monastery, suggesting his own wanderlust. In Sign of Jonas, he confessed thoughts of relocation and the foolishness of these thoughts. It is really illogical, he said, that I should get temptations to run off to another monastery, to another order. In the same work, recording events from 1949, he wrote, "There is something in my nature that makes me dream of being a tramp." He writes about this more than once. When friends became convinced that he was straying into the world too much, they decided they wanted to bring him back to a monastic attitude and to understand the monk's life, and so they planned an intervention with him. A psychiatrist was engaged to analyze Merton based on Merton's writing and the reports of others. Without ever personally meeting Merton, never interviewing him by phone or in any other way, but simply going on the works and what these friends said about him, he wrote his diagnosis of Merton. The abbot was in on the deal, if you please, and so the abbot gave him permission to attend a conference where this psychiatrist was going to be speaking, and because of his interest in psychology and has a very strong Jungian influence in Merton, he went to this conference somewhat excited, and there he was ambushed, if you please, by this psychiatrist who accused him of being an exhibitionist who wanted to have a hermitage on Times Square. The abbot had been in on us all the time. From that time forward, he really seems obsessed with this idea of solitude and feeling guilt there, though it would have been a great loss for the world, great loss for the church, had he really lived the cloistered life. Merton's friendship with poet-priest Ernesto Cardenal, a liberationist working in Nicaragua, moved Merton to long for a place of service. That was always important to Merton. How can I serve the world? Cardenal spent time at Gethsemane, during which he planned a monastery in Cuernavaca. He invited Merton to make it his place of service. Merton applied for permission to move and was upset, very angry when it was not granted. In his journals, written on the Faithful Asian Journey, if you want to see this wanderlust, just an Asian journal, he identified Alaska as the perfect place for a hermitage. With glowing terms, he described a ranch in California as an ideal place for contemplation. And in his last notes in a letter to Gethsemane, he expressed a longing to return home to Kentucky. Whether or not he would have returned has become a matter of debate and controversy. There are those who argued that he would not. I think he would have returned in that way. But he was always there. I also, this is just a little addendum from me, my experience with him. When I was invited to become director of the Thomas Merton Study Center at Bellarmine, I asked the president and the dean, why me? Why not a Catholic? By the way, the next president said it had to be a Catholic and fired me, but at this time, he said, we need somebody who does not think he already knows everything about Merton. And I've discovered over the years that if you talk to one person about Merton, he is sure I'm the only one with whom he really was earnest. I'm the only one who really understood Merton. And everyone you talk to is that way. And certainly one of Merton's weaknesses was an inability to confront. There's one place in his diary, it's not in the paper, one place in his notes where he says, Sister so-and-so was here today, another of her foolish notions, and I let her go away thinking I agreed. This may have been a part here, that every one of these groups he came in contact with, he wanted to affirm them by telling them they had the perfect place for him. Place, though, was not primary for Merton. It was not a place he sought, I think, but a heritage, an identity. His early formation may well have been the key to his whole life. Indeed, I think it is. And his spiritual discoveries. It is doubtful whether anyone could suffer the series of losses that Merton endured without having them shape his life journey. It began for Merton with a tragic illness and death of his mother. His mother adored him. If you go to the Merton Center, you can see Tom's book, which is a book she kept on his early childhood and development. He had a sense of just adoration from her. But her loss was to really take its toll. It was an extraordinary relationship. And then, sadly, she went to the hospital. When it was discovered she had cancer, she went to the hospital, and she instructed that Tom was not to be brought to the hospital, that she did not want him to see her in that condition. So if you can imagine this, you have a young child, his mother goes off to the hospital. All he ever gets is later he gets a letter which she has written to him explaining her death, and he never sees her again. So certainly the loss was enhanced by that. This was a struggle for him, certainly. He learned of her impending death by this farewell note. To make matters worse, his father was so struck with grief, he abandoned Tom and his younger brother to grandparents and traveled to escape the loss. His travels away from home while Ruth was still alive had already intensified that sense of absence. I've already commented on that. In 1924, only 3 years after Ruth's death, his father, Owen, was struck with fatal illness. Tom, lonely and depressed, was sent to live with Owen's aunt in Ealing, West London, where he attended the preparatory school and where he was miserable in that school. And he never felt comfortable there and never had any sense of peer relationship there. In 1931, his often absentee father died. Tom ended up a ward of an old classmate of his dad's, and now began the odyssey that would take him to Rome, Florence, Cambridge, Paris, and a period of excessive drinking, sexual promiscuity. He confessed to having fathered a child. Lloyd mentioned this last night. And obvious searching for a place or person that might help him discover who he was. His guardian became disgusted with his behavior and was disappointed. But Tom, like so many people, young people, particularly that period, was seeking some kind of ultimate experience that would give his life meaning and purpose. The discouraged warder pressured Tom to settle down and apply his mind for development for the future of his abilities. And the next stop was Columbia University in New York. At Columbia, his behavior was somewhat reformed, but his intellectual and spiritual curiosity remained intense. Over the next few years, he spent time in Cuba, time with Dorothy Day and her justice work in New York. He flirted with communism, joined the Young Communist League, but never the party. Although it should be noted that he did later on, in fact, one of the lectures that he had prepared to deliver he never got to deliver it, in Bangkok on that Asian journey, was a lecture on Marxism. And many of you know that dialogue between Marxism and Christian philosophers was very popular for a period. People like Marcuse and others were carrying on this dialogue. And so it was a very natural experience. And he said that what he agreed, he thought, in fact, and some of you will be familiar with this, at one place he says you have to be a communist in order to be a Christian. But what he meant by that was in terms of the attitude toward material things and toward wealth, toward capitalism, and that kind of attitude, that you needed to put the totality of people before those things. The lecture was entitled Marxism and Monastic Perspectives that he was delivering. There were, of course, great times with his friends. He enjoyed partying, enjoyed especially the summers that he spent with his brother John Paul, whom he adored. Together they had fun to movies, and they boasted of having seen every movie produced in the years between 1934 and 1936. And he made friends at the university who would remain the friends for the rest of his life. In fact, I think one has a sense that he never really has friends at the monastery. His friends are more these friends from this period of searching in his life. But Columbia broadened his world, his time with Mark Van Doren, Dan Walsh, who would later become his important spiritual mentor, who would introduce him to Gethsemane, stirred him to seek more and more literary and philosophical knowledge. He voraciously read writers like Aldous Huxley, Etienne Gilson, who introduced him to St. Bonaventure, William Blake. He wrote his doctoral dissertation, or his master's, I think it was, on William Blake. And Gerald Manley Hopkins was another of his interests at this time. And they all contributed to his own thought and writing. Indeed, he wrote somewhere that he would first encounter the word mysticism, the idea of mysticism, in Huxley's Ends and Means. Surely we can assume that he was also reading those popular writers of that period, people like Thomas Wolfe and others, those who were labeled the lost generation. These writers wrote of their own pilgrimages and their searches for home, progenitors. During this period, he encountered the Hindu monk, Brahmachari, who in a series of discussions between the two, it was this wise Eastern monk who encouraged Merton to explore the rich mystical resources of his own Western tradition. In 1939, Tom was baptized a Catholic. The peace this brought was temporary, but one senses in Seven Story Mountain that he was joyful over his conversion. He writes, I think it's in Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, and this struck chord with me from Pat and I, our experience over the years with Baptists, about those preachers who preach sunshine religion. Well, he has experience here. You have the sense that for a period he had sunshine religion, and certainly this is not a bad thing. It ought to be a time of joy. This was probably the happiest time of his life. But sadly, his losses were not an end. He recalls the death of his beloved brother, John Paul, in Seven Story Mountain. John Paul was an Air Force pilot in the United States Air Force, was shot down over the North Sea. Struggled there. His fellow soldiers reported that he struggled there in the water for a great deal of time, was gotten out of the water, but eventually died and was buried at sea. Again, a loss for Tom this way. He wrote a poem about this. I just share just one phrase of this, one stanza. Sweet brother, if I do not sleep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. And if I cannot eat my bread, my fast shall live like willows where you died. If in the heat I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Well, Merton arrived at Gethsemane feeling he'd found a home, a family, and a vocation. At the end of Seven Story Mountain, he wrote, by this time, I should have been delivered by my problems about my identity. But then there was, he said, this writer who had followed me to the cloister. He said that he felt like the old man of the sea. At that time, he was adrift in the sea of life, but had Christ at this point as his compass. He had a new name, Brother Lewis, but was he a new man? John Calvin, now to get to his ideas, John Calvin began the institution of Christian religion with an assertion that's often debated as to its meaning, that true love and substantial wisdom principally consist of two parts, the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. but he must immediately turn to contemplation of God. Calvin goes on to argue that man, and I would say, or woman, must become aware of his or her other lost state in order to be free from the sin that binds. Merton wrote, "There is no question whatever that self-knowledge is fundamental to all spiritual life. There can be no order, no tranquility, and above all, no true knowledge of God, where unknown or half-known roots of sin still grow and flourish in the spirit of man." Merton did not understand the process to be one, I think he's sometimes misrepresented here, of unselving, casting off the self. Quite the contrary, he wrote in Life and Holiness, sanctity is not a matter of being less human, but being more human. At Gethsemane, Merton's quest was not ended, but only entering a new phase. He began to realize, to paraphrase Augustine, that man was made for God and shall not rest till he rests for God. Merton would come to see this inward drive as a force in all human beings, even non-Christians. He noted God lives in the souls of men who are conscious of him. How can I say that I have found him and found myself in him if I never know or think of him? Let me stop here for just a moment and apologize if you are offended by his sexist language. His language is not inclusive at all. I would remind you that he's a product of his time, and after all, he lived in the monastery in a world of men. So I think you would have to keep this in mind. I've tried to be as inclusive as I can be in my comments. Some have observed that Merton was not an original thinker, but as I mentioned before, he had the ability to by transforming it into human experience. Glenn Hinson summarized this idea. Merton's originality lay, Hinson said, therefore, in the way he fed the whole tradition of contemplation through his own fitted and fertile mind and personality, so as to create a profound new synthesis which could speak not only to his monastic confreres, but even to the wider circle of humanity. R.E. Walsh wrote of contemplatives in general that mysticism for many devoted spirits is a way out of the maze of scholastic philosophy and ecclesiastical dissension. He sought immediate awareness of the spirit above thinking. One can find in the ever-changing thought of Merton a Hegelian dialectic and phenomenology of spirit, thesis and antithesis resulting in a new synthesis. If one insists on giving him an energizing philosophy, it would have to be, I think, personalism. And this personalism marks his work a great deal. I'm going to skip down a little bit in the interest of time here. Merton's applied personalism took the form of what many would identify as humanism. The answer to the world's self-destructive tendencies is to be found in the recovery of the divine image in which we are created. This image can be seen in the new man of which the Apostle Paul wrote. To discover the union with God expressed in every birth will result in a supernatural love for his friends, Merton writes, and his relatives, and those with whom he lives and works. Sometimes it's harder with the relatives than it is with the friends, isn't it? In New Seeds of Contemplation, he wrote of the function of faith, which he said is not only to bring us into contact with the authority of God revealing, not only to teach us faith in God, but even to reveal to us the unknown in our own selves, insofar as our unknown and undiscovered selves live in God. Every person, he believed, is a candidate for mystical transformation, which unleashes the love of Christ in the human being. Each man and woman must share in the search for God and self. Several different places Merton writes about the importance of working out our own salvation, quoting, of course, the Apostle Paul. Not all persons are called to be monks, but Merton believed that all do have a vocation for contemplation, whatever task their individual gifts permit. We do not have a choice, he said, of placing ourselves in one or the other side of the Mary Martha syndrome, but must allow both sides to be expressed. Humanity, created in the image of God, is dependent on the transforming power of God demonstrated in the Christ. Merton contended that Christian humanism is the full flowering of the theology of the incarnation. It is rooted in a totally new concept of man, which grew out of the mystery of the union of God and man in Christ. It is the full realization of man's dignity and obligations as Son of God, as image of God, created, regenerated, and transformed in the Word made flesh. He insisted that Christian humanism not be confused with American individualism. American individualism, he said, I can't speak this morning, places personal material success, which owes nothing to God or community, with no obligation or responsibility for others, at the center of being. It's based more on Darwinism than Christianity. This is the nature of human sin. Orthodox Christians attacked Merton for his dismissal of the theory of total depravity. Original sin had to contend with original goodness. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. Genesis 1:27. He wrote, "There is no evil in anything created by God, nor can anything of his become an obstacle to union with him. The obstacle is ourself, that is to say, the tenacious need to maintain our separate, external, egotistical will. Alienation from God is of human, not divine choice. We struggle to be separate out of blindness to God's goodness within us. The sin that imprisons us is that of illusion." He says, to say we are born in sin is to say we are born in illusion and blindness, and this blindness makes us fall into every other evil. In each human dwells the love of God, which never went away, a source available in the experience of God, immanent and transcendent. He wrote, "At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusion, a point of pure truth, a point or spark which belongs entirely to God, from which God disposes of our lives, which is inaccessible to the fantasies of our own mind or the brutalities of our own will. This little point of nothingness is, so to speak, his name written in us. It is like a pure diamond blazing with the invisible light of heaven. It is in everybody. And if we could see it, we would see these billions of points of light coming together in the face and blaze of the sun that would make all the darkness and cruelty of life vanish completely." This was the ultimate experience he sought, the realization of the God of spirit and flesh, fully alive in human being. This was so important to me in my own development as a person, as a Christian. I had heard so many sermons telling me how evil I was and how totally deprived I was. And here Merton said, no, your basic character is not evil. Your basic character is goodness. And that's what you have to get to and discover. The problem is to break through the facade of the false self to reach the God within. God is not out there. God is not up there. God is in there. This is the solution not only for the individual, but also for society. Merton wrote about his epiphany standing on the busy corner in Louisville. Lloyd referred to this last night, but I want to read a little different part of it. "I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization I love all these people, and they are mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. Then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of the heart, the depths of their hearts where neither sin nor doubt nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their reality, the person that each one has God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time, there would be no more wars, no more hatred, no more cruelty, and no more greed. The image of God, through the grace of Christ, could be recovered, or perhaps better it's to say uncovered. The only true joy, Merton said, is to escape from the prison of false self and enter by love into union with the life who dwells and sings within the essence of every creature and in the core of our souls. So he disparaged this doctrine of original sin and does affirm universalism. He does firmly believe that all persons are created in the image of God, created for God's purpose, and will ultimately return to God. The urge to break out of the false self is not of our own seeking, but rather responding to the God who is seeking us. The experience of God is a gift to God, perhaps what we call grace. Integration of self and union with God is something that no human agency can perform or merit, or even conceive of by itself. This work has to be done by the direct intervention of God. We can only prepare and dispose ourselves to the Holy Spirit. And here again is the proposition of our inquiry affirmed. Lloyd mentioned this last night, the notion that there is no formula. There's no way that you can be sure of reaching these places. There's no book of directions that can be given to you. One has to be open to the experience of God, and God is seeking us all this time. There's only one problem on which my existence, my peace, my happiness depend: to discover myself in discovering God. If I find Him, I will find myself. And if I find my true self, I will find Him. All men and women, without regard to human attempts to differentiate by ethnicity, nationality, geography, or culture, are the objects of God's love and God's search. It is not ours to choose to awake ourselves, Merton observed, but God who chooses to awaken us. The question, to awaken us to what? Our true self. Here again is the proposition of this paper affirmed. Therefore, there's only one problem on which my existence, my peace, my happiness depends: to discover myself in discovering God. And if I find God, I will find myself. And if I find my true self, I will find God. All men and women, without regard to human attempts, are subjects of His love and His search. Salvation, Merton believed that human freedom develops only in the existential encounter between man and God, because not only Christians encounter God, but every man, and I would add woman, at some point in his life encounters God. For Merton, salvation was the discovery of the true self. All persons, he believed, have a common destiny. We find the Lord when we find His gift of life in the depths of ourself. He points out that the notion of rebirth is not peculiar to Christianity. In Sufism, Zen Buddhism, many other religions or spiritual traditions, emphasis is placed on the call to fulfill certain obscure yet urgent potentialities in the ground of one's being, to become someone that one already is, the person one is truly meant to be. Merton's idea of Catholicity went far beyond back to the Greek roots of the word, referring not to the Catholic Church, but to the universal body of humankind and the universal body of Christ. He wrote, and this is fairly early, "I will be a better Catholic, not if I can refute every shade of Protestantism, but if I can affirm the truth in it and still go further. So too with the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists. This does not mean syncretism and differentism, the vapid and careless friendliness that accepts everything by thinking of nothing. There is much that one cannot affirm or accept, but one must say yes where we really can. If I affirm myself as a Catholic merely by denying all that is Muslim, Jewish, Protestant, Hindu, Buddhist, in the end I will find there's not much left for me to confirm as a Catholic, and certainly no breath of the Spirit to affirm it." These statements make it pretty clear. When he got to Asia, he had those meetings with the Dalai Lama, and he said that he discovered that there was a real spiritual bond between us. And the Dalai Lama said that Merton was the first true Christian he'd ever met and taught him more about Christianity. And the Dalai Lama said that Merton was one of the 3 persons who most influenced his own life. I believe in his final lecture, he wrote, I believe that by openness to Buddhism, to Hinduism, to these great Asian traditions, we stand a wonderful chance of learning more about the potentiality of our own Christian traditions, because they have gone from the natural point of view so much deeper into this than we have. And this always saddens me. Those of you who've seen the Merton film, this is the last lecture he delivered and the last film he made, and this is the last line of that lecture. Now I will disappear from view, and we can all go have a Coke or something. Merton did not subscribe to traditional views of Christ or the atonement. He certainly didn't hold the ransom theory. If his thinking can be viewed through the lens of any of the accepted theories of the atonement, it would have to be the moral influence theory, somewhat championed by Augustine. Merton treats Christ as a paradigm, perhaps revealing a Jungian influence. He says that Christ is an archetype of one created in the image of God, unsullied by sin or the delusion of false self. That Christ became man in order to be a pattern. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? How will I look? How will I act? How will I know that? I know that by observing Christ, who was this manifestation. Why did Christ become man, Merton wrote, if not to save men by uniting them mystically with God through his own sacred humanity? Jesus lived the ordinary life of the men of his time in order to sanctify the ordinary lives of men of all times. He was truly a son of man, in a mirror revealing us to ourselves when the divine image of creation is recovered. He said that Christ experienced all the emotions common to humanity: affection, pity, sorrow, happiness, pleasure, grief, indignation, wonder, weariness, anxiety, fear, consolation, and peace. He, by his earthly sojourn, affirmed not only the goodness of soul, whatever that is, but the goodness of the flesh. And so Christ provides the pattern for the new person. And those who respond affirmatively to God's sermons to change are reconstituted in a transforming presence resulting in the spiritual man or woman. In biblical terms, reconciliation with God results in reconciliation with all creation. When the encounter is real and complete, Merton says, a new kind of relationship is established between our own freedom and the ultimate freedom and spirit, the God who is love and is also the Lord of history. At the same time, a new relationship with other men comes into being. Instead of our living for ourselves, we live for them. Mankind would visibly become the Christ through this epiphany in Christ. The Christian finds himself or herself in union with Christ. Every man and woman is called to follow Christ and to become the Christ, the conduct of the new man toward and for others' new being. It is respect to the social ramification of humanity's new status that the evolution of Merton's thought is most notable, from his withdrawal period to his maturity, where he becomes a spiritual participant in the throes of history. My time's getting away. The Christian knows that there are radically sound possibilities in every human being. We become Christ, he said, by knowledge and love. Through the incarnation of Christ reflects divinity in purest form, and our union with Christ means being in God and like God, whose nature is love. And these ideas he reflects Eckhart, who was someone he read quite a bit and was quite influenced by. And of course, you know, Eckhart was being tried for heresy when he died. If my interpretation of these ideas are on target, Merton may come into that. I don't know. The birthright of every person is to be the image of the divine to contain and reflect the Creator God. The three primary motifs in Merton's writing, all his writing, is freedom, union, and love. They dominate his work. Freedom from the false self in order to accept the true divine self, a thread running through his writings. It is when the created accepts freedom that she becomes person with all the privileges and responsibilities inferred in the concept of sacred freedom. What we seek is our birthright, which we squandered for a mess of pottage. He says again, there is no evil in anything or anyone created by God. Everything made by God is good. I don't think it's pantheism, but I think it's a kind of panentheism, if you please. Humans succumb to the illusions, perhaps delusions of the false self and the momentary pleasures which they make ultimate. And this results in alienation. Merton was often critical of religion, and many of us can identify with that. He said sects and cults strive to control the self. But true religion is what we do with the freedom given to us by God. I want to skip over here and speak of some of my conclusions, which may be here. One who has experienced the pure love of God in union becomes a source of love for others. If we are to love sincerely and with simplicity, we must first of all overcome the fear of not being loved. Now, this is very important. I think this is at the heart of Merton's dis-ease, uncomfortness, and the reason I don't think he ever found peace. He goes on to say that there is a need to recognize in how many ways we are unlovable. Merton never liked himself. He never trusted his own instincts and urges. Such a statement leads one to wonder if the string of familial losses early in life did not affect him in this way. To be free through union is to be transformed to God and to have His love and the love of new creation become. But here, this love, personal love, one-on-one love, was the rub for Father Lewis. This latest attempt on my part to explore the writings of Merton has led me to an unhappy conclusion. I do not believe that Merton ever found true peace. The premature end of his odyssey was an unsatisfactory one. His wisdom served others better than himself. Insecurity and depression plagued him to the untimely end of his life on this earth. Not much has been written of his physical maladies that tortured his body. But in the early years of the monastery, he often suffered the weakening effects. And you have to know, I don't have time to go into this, but when he went into the monastery, they were still sleeping in cold cells on the floor, on hard places. They were still practicing self-flagellation once a week, very limited diet, only permitted a bath once a week. And so a lot of his illness was accentuated by these conditions, which are changed now. But by the way, sadly, there are only 40 monks at Gethsemane today, and most of them are getting old. They've only had 2 new initiates in the last 3 or 4 years. He noted in conjectures, a man is most human and proves his humanity, I did not say virility, he says, by the quality of his relationship with women. He hints of concerns about his own ability to have a satisfying relationship with the opposite sex. Everyone completely forgets the need for love. He says a desperate need, not the need to receive it, but the need to give love. He expressed concern about his ability to love individuals. John Howard Griffin, who was kind enough to share his notes with me, Griffin was the first official biographer of Merton, but unfortunately he never could. He kept gathering research and couldn't get it down, and he died before the task could be complete, and it was passed on to the man his widow married. John Howard Griffin recorded in his notes that he deduced from Merton's journals for the year 1965. A quick review of the past indicated 2 things to the hermit. his lack of love, or rather his selfishness and glibness, springing from his deep shyness and need of love with girls. But that was hardly worth thinking about now, 25 years later. What he found most in his whole life was an illusion, the need to be something of which he had formed a concept. I hope I'll get free of that now, he said, because that's going to be the struggle. And yet he felt that he had to be something following a concept of what he ought to meet a certain demand for order, inner light, and tranquility. But he must cease striving for these on his own. Rather, he must remove these obstacles that prevented God. Merton recorded elsewhere, I suppose I regret most my lack of love with girls. I think for a time my great fault was my inability really to believe it, and my efforts to get complete assurance and perfect fulfillment, so that one thing on my mind is sex, as something I did use maturely and well, something I gave up without having to come to terms with it, that's hardly worth thinking about now, 25 years since my last adultery. Merton's pilgrimage came to this violent end. I think he was pressing on toward the end, and there have been, by the way, just throw this in for those of you who seriously know Merton know this, an article in the Irish Times which goes into more detail about this infatuation that he had with this nurse half his age in Louisville, seeks to say that Merton did not die accidentally, but he committed suicide because he was pining for his lost love. I don't believe that, and I don't think most Merton scholars do. But there is also a new book just out you'll all want to read that has absolute proof that he was murdered by the CIA because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. My favorite prayer of Merton's, and one which the last 15 years I was a pastor, I read every first Sunday of the new year to the congregation, and one which I still pray myself at the beginning of every year. My Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I'm following your will does not mean I'm actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I'm doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me. You will never leave me to my perils alone. I think this is appropriate for his experience, and he leaves us with this idea: we all need one another. We all complete one another, and God's will is found in this mutual interdependence, an interdependence which emerges from love. Well, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for your reflections on Thomas Merton. Remember, you have these cards. You might have some napkins on your table. If question or two before we take a break for Dr. Bailey? Anybody? Okay. Dr. Bailey, if nothing created by God can become an obstacle to union with God, and since humanity or persons are created in the image of God, i.e. creations of God, then how can we become obstacles to union with God? Where in creation does the false self arise? I'm going to read this for everybody one more time. Okay.
Read the answer, too. When you
The answers to Lady Bears come on in about 2 hours. All of you did mysticism with Glenn. I did patristics with Glenn. It's different. If nothing created by God can become an obstacle to union with God, and since humanity or persons are created in the image of God, i.e. creations of God, then how can we become obstacles to union with God? When in creation does the false self arise?
Well, I think it arises at all with our own, that blindness and illusion that comes so often in our birth and our creation. I'm trying to remember. I wish I could remember. There's a kind of, I think it's a Hindu myth. There's a myth of one of the Eastern religions that said every child who is born, the spiritual master touches his lip, and that's where this indentation we all have comes from, and whispers in his ear, "Forget, forget." And the idea is forget the God from whom you've come, and then the rest of the life is the search for that God whom you've forgotten. And I think it is in that. I think that we have to say maybe this, and it's inadequate, that everything created in this world, if you go back to the Bible, if you want to be a literalist at this point, after God created everything, he said, and that's good. Everything God created was good. Therefore, everything evil is a distortion or misuse or abuse of that good thing. And nearly everything we can think of. You can take religion, religion can be a wonderful thing for us, and it can be a terrible thing. And because it is so important to us and so much a part of our nature is the reason we can make it such an ugly and destructive thing. But it is this lostness in this world that it happens. But that's all. I'd have to work more on that. Next paper, I'll do that.
We've got some good questions here. I'm going to combine two of these, and I understand they don't go together, but they fascinate me. First half, does anyone ever look at Merton through the lens of the Enneagram? And second, I'm hearing a lot of Richard Rohr in Merton, false self-ego. Does Rohr rely heavily on Merton? So in other words, what kind of influence might Merton be having today in things that we know about Enneagram and Richard Rohr?
I know it's been done, the Enneagram, but I haven't seen it or looked at it, so I can't comment on that, but it has been done. And you can see in Henry Nouwen and Nouwen's works, the imprint of Merton. Merton was highly influential with Nouwen. Nouwen was in his classes. And certainly Richard Rohr does reflect a lot of Merton. And I don't think he, I better not say that. But he does reflect a lot of Merton. And that would be true. One of the sad things for me is when I meet new Catholic friends, I can't resist asking, do you know Thomas Merton? And most of them don't. And you can see why. There are a lot of questions about his Christology, his atonement, and so forth. And of course, it was argued he was going to become a Buddhist and all that sort of stuff. But he continues. He influenced a whole generation of men and women who are continuing to influence others. And his books are very popular. And the center, I don't know whether it's the center or the Merton board or who does it. I'm not on the inside of that. But they continue to put out books. There's now a book on spiritual directorship by Thomas Merton. Well, he didn't write that. But what they did was take his teaching notes and his lectures within the monastery and put them. And so you get a whole bunch of books that have come out later. Some of his material could not be touched for 25 years, until 25 years after his death, to try to protect certain people and certain names. And of course now all that is coming out. But there are many new books coming out, and I think because of the richness of any, when you think what makes something a classic is its universal appeal and its associational value. It is common to humanity, and we can appropriate it. The thing that attracted me to Merton, I mean, I'm just a ignorant East Texas preacher boy. I grew up in Dallas, and all of a sudden I read this guy. At our house we didn't say Catholic, we said Catholic, and my dad, who did not go to church, said I could go to church anywhere I wanted to, but I couldn't go to Catholic church because they were evil. But in all of that, when I read Merton, I said, here is a person who can express what I have felt and couldn't express or put into words. And I think that's what great writers, you can't take away from the fact that Merton was a literary genius, if you like. He could have written novels, or he considered himself a poet as much as anything else. And so he had the gift of expression that gives form to that which is the inexpressible. So I think he's still a subtle influence. I wish he were a broader influence. I wish more people were talking about him.
I'd like to keep us on schedule, so last question, I'm going to put them together, but the first one was quite interesting and builds on what Dr. Bailey said. What happens to those who never realize the original goodness of the creation? You talked a little bit about that. But maybe you can end with this. You need to finish this sentence. I have a fill-in-the-blank test back from your day.
I never did well on that.
Oh, no. Name something you most disagree with Merton about. So, what happens to those who never realize the original goodness of their creation? And finish with something you disagree with.
Well, I can answer those two together because I'm not a universalist. Whereas Merton and those who hold this view, and I have some close friends who do, it is a wonderful idea. But I think God respects us too much to force us against our will. I think that when you say we are created in the image of God, then we are given the freedom to choose. And I think we have that right. Now, I go ahead and go on record, since I'm not on any Baptist faculty anymore, I can't be fired, and say I do not believe in a burning, fiery hell. I'm probably more influenced by Eric Rust's notion of annihilationism. But I do think there is that human freedom. So I would disagree with Merton on universalism, I think.
Okay. Let's give Dr. Bailey a hand.